Val Kilmer's final act wasn't performed under the bright lights of Hollywood or in front of millions of adoring fans. It unfolded quietly, far away from the cameras, in a way that stunned even those who knew him best. When the legendary actor who once embodied Batman, Jim Morrison, and Iceman passed away at 65, the world expected headlines filled with glamour, public tributes, and a funeral worthy of his status. Instead, his departure was eerily silent, almost hidden, as if he had been rehearsing for this very moment in private for years. But that silence shattered when his children, Mercedes and Jack, opened a carefully prepared will. What they discovered inside wasn't just wealth or property. It was something far more personal, more haunting, and powerful enough to bring them to tears. Because while Hollywood will remember Val Kilmer for his unforgettable roles, his family discovered that his greatest performance was the one he left behind in his final farewell. When the news of Val Kilmer's death broke, it didn't arrive with the thunder one might expect from a Hollywood legend. There were no elaborate ceremonies, no grand public memorials splashed across headlines. Instead, the world learned almost in passing that the star who had once defined cinematic eras in Top Gun, The Doors, and Batman Forever had slipped away quietly at the age of 65. For nearly a decade, he had been living in the shadow of illness, his once vibrant presence dimmed not by scandal or fading fame, but by a deliberate choice to retreat from the world. His departure was not marked by spectacle, but by silence, a silence that mirrored how he had lived his final years. Far removed from Hollywood's constant flash, Kilmer found solace in solitude, spending his days on his ranch in New Mexico, writing, painting, and reflecting. To outsiders, it seemed like he had vanished. But behind closed doors, he was preparing something profoundly intentional, something that would outlive him. Just days after his passing, his family gathered in Los Angeles, in the home that had once served as his private workspace. The atmosphere was heavy with grief, but also with a strange sense of anticipation. For Val Kilmer was not the kind of man to leave without one last statement. And as his longtime attorney of nearly 2 decades laid a thick 27-page will before his children, Mercedes and Jack, it became clear that their father had orchestrated a farewell unlike any other. Inside, they found more than legal instructions or financial distributions. What awaited them were personal letters, encrypted hard drives, and carefully arranged mementos that Kilmer had curated over years of preparation. Every detail had been thought through, every piece labeled and dated, as if he had been editing the final cut of his own life. This wasn't just the dividing of assets, it was the final act of a man who had always taken control of his narrative, right down to the last breath. And in that moment, his silence finally spoke louder than words ever could. Val Kilmer had left his family not only wealth, but an intimate archive of himself. Fragments of time, memories, and lessons he wanted them to carry long after he was gone. What they held in their hands was not simply a will, but the most personal performance of his career, his carefully scripted goodbye. For Mercedes Kilmer, the envelope she opened revealed more than just her father's words. Inside was a letter written entirely by hand, the ink still bold, the lines deeply pressed into the paper as if Val had poured his last reserves of strength into every stroke. Alongside it was a small, handcrafted wooden box. When she lifted its lid, she found more than 300 unpublished photographs, snapshots from film sets, quiet moments in kitchens, long-forgotten family trips, and even private shots from behind the scenes of Top Gun and Batman Forever. One photograph was framed separately, a simple picture of father and daughter taken on barren land near the family ranch. On the back, he had scribbled just 3 words, "Salt Sky, Ours." It was a reference to an unpublished screenplay he had once written, and a symbol of the private world only the two of them shared. Jack's inheritance was no less emotional. He received a handwritten manuscript of an unfinished screenplay titled only "If You're Ready to Tell Your Story." Along with it was a typed letter addressed to himself at the age of 30, his exact age when the will was read. The lawyer read it aloud in the stillness of the room. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. But everything you need to understand me is right here in every word, every silence." For Jack, it wasn't just a message from a father. It was a challenge, a passing of the torch, and an invitation to continue the work Val had left unfinished. But the will didn't stop at sentimental gestures. Kilmer had amassed an estate estimated between $10 and $25 million, spread across royalties, real estate, and investments. Yet even this wealth was carefully allocated. Mercedes and Jack were to share most of it equally, but with one unusual clause, the maintenance of his secluded 160-acre property in New Mexico. In the will, he wrote, "Keep this place if you need peace or want to write a story of your own without telling anyone." It wasn't just land, it was a sanctuary, a place he wanted preserved for them as a refuge from the noise of the world. Friends who later learned of the will said they weren't surprised. Val Kilmer had always seen his life as art, and even in death, he remained consistent. He didn't want his children to simply inherit money. He wanted them to inherit him. Every photo, every letter, every folder on the encrypted drives was meticulously labeled, as if he was leaving them a library of his soul. For Mercedes and Jack, the pain of loss was tempered by the feeling that their father was still speaking to them, through images, through words, through the fragments of a life he had refused to let fade away. It wasn't the numbers on paper that made them cry. It was the realization that their father had spent his final years not thinking of himself, but of them. The will was not about what he owned, but about what he remembered. And in that moment, Mercedes and Jack understood. Val Kilmer's greatest legacy was not Batman, not Iceman, not Jim Morrison. It was the way he had silently prepared his family for a life without him. Val Kilmer's will did more than secure his family's future. It revealed a side of him that few outside his closest circle had ever truly seen. Tucked between clauses and carefully worded instructions was a vision that extended far beyond his children. He had quietly set aside a portion of his estate for causes that mattered deeply to him, a fund dedicated to throat cancer research and another supporting arts training for underprivileged children in New Mexico. For a man who had spent decades speaking through characters, this was his way of ensuring that even in silence, his voice would continue to echo where it was needed most. The revelation that Kilmer had long been an anonymous sponsor of a local theater program stunned many. For years, no one knew who was funding the classes that allowed dozens of children in small New Mexico towns to discover acting, music, and painting. Only after his death was it confirmed that the mysterious benefactor had been the very man who once commanded Hollywood blockbusters. It was a reminder that Kilmer's true love for art was never confined to film sets or fame. It was about keeping creativity alive in its purest form. Those who handled his estate said the process was unlike any they had ever seen. His attorney, who had worked with countless celebrities, admitted that most wills are about money, assets, and the cold mechanics of distribution. Kilmer's, however, was different. It was personal, intentional, and carefully curated, more like an autobiography told through gifts than a legal document. Each page carried evidence of a man who had spent years thinking not about himself, but about the people and causes he would one day leave behind. Friends later revealed that Kilmer had re-recorded some of his video messages dozens of times. He wanted to get every word right, every pause deliberate, every smile genuine. To outsiders, this might sound obsessive, but to those who knew him, it was classic Val, an artist to the very end, editing his own farewell as if it were the most important role of his life. In a world where celebrity estates are often reduced to headlines about wealth and disputes, Val Kilmer's stood apart. His wasn't a goodbye written in numbers, it was one written in purpose. Through research, through art, through the memories he left behind, Kilmer had crafted a legacy that could not be bought, sold, or forgotten. It was the kind of inheritance that outlives money, the inheritance of meaning. Val Kilmer's quiet farewell didn't happen overnight. It was shaped by nearly a decade of living with a disease he tried desperately to keep hidden. Around 2014, whispers began spreading in Hollywood. Kilmer appeared thinner, frailer, his once commanding presence replaced by a gaunt look that sparked rumors about his health. For 3 years, he denied the speculation, brushing off questions with vague answers or outright silence. To the public, it seemed like the star was simply retreating. But behind that retreat was a brutal truth he wasn't yet ready to share. By 2017, the secret could no longer be contained. At a live event in Los Angeles, Kilmer finally admitted he had been battling throat cancer. The disease had advanced quietly, forcing him through multiple rounds of chemotherapy and radiation. 2 invasive tracheotomy surgeries robbed him of the very thing that had once defined him, his voice. Directors had described it as rich and musical, a voice that could command a room. Now, it was reduced to fragmented whispers, often dependent on machines to be heard at all. The loss of his voice wasn't just a physical blow, it was emotional devastation. For an actor whose career had been built on words, on monologues, on embodying characters through sound and expression, the silence felt cruel. Eating became difficult. Socializing felt exhausting. For long stretches, he relied on feeding tubes and avoided public appearances altogether. He chose instead to withdraw to his ranch in New Mexico, surrounded not by industry colleagues but by canvases, journals, and old film reels. Yet, even in his suffering, Kilmer refused to surrender. He spent hours painting, writing poetry, and editing personal videos, his way of continuing to create when his body betrayed him. These videos, often recorded in solitude, later became part of the encrypted archives he left for his children. They weren't performances for an audience. They were conversations he still wanted to have, lessons he still wanted to teach, even if his voice couldn't carry them. In 2020, Kilmer broke his silence with his memoir, I'm Your Huckleberry. For the first time, he described the psychological weight of losing control over his body, the loneliness of battling an illness he had hidden for years, and the strange clarity that came with isolation. The book wasn't bitter. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. Instead, it read like a man documenting his reality with honesty, almost detachment, as if he had already accepted his fate. His fans saw a glimpse of the private battle he had endured, but even then, Kilmer kept much of the pain to himself. The full story would only be revealed after he was gone. For years, Val Kilmer's fans assumed his days on the big screen were over. His illness had robbed him of his voice, and Hollywood had all but moved on. But in 2022, against all odds, he made one final, unforgettable return. When Top Gun Maverick hit theaters, audiences gasped as the familiar figure of Tom Iceman Kazansky appeared on screen. It wasn't a cameo for nostalgia's sake, it was a carefully planned tribute, a farewell that only Kilmer could deliver. The role had been shrouded in secrecy. Paramount had avoided any leaks, wanting the moment to land with maximum impact. Behind the scenes, Tom Cruise himself had lobbied for Kilmer's inclusion, insisting the film wouldn't be complete without him. Cruise reportedly visited Kilmer at home several times, encouraging him to take the part even though it required extraordinary effort. Kilmer, reluctant at first, eventually agreed. For him, it wasn't just about reprising Iceman, it was about showing the world that he still had something left to give. When the cameras finally rolled, the crew knew they were witnessing something more than just a scene. Kilmer's body was frail, his voice gone, but his eyes carried the same fire audiences remembered from 1986. The brief exchange between Maverick and Iceman was tender, haunting, and unforgettable. For many viewers, it wasn't just a reunion of characters, it was a goodbye between two men who had once stood at opposite ends of fame and rivalry, now facing each other as equals, both scarred by time. What made the moment even more remarkable was the technology that made it possible. Kilmer's dialogue in the film was not his voice at all. It was an artificial recreation, pieced together using AI trained on hundreds of hours of his past interviews, films, and recordings. The result was a digital resurrection of a sound that had once defined him. Fans later learned that Kilmer had signed off on the technology himself, seeing it as a way to speak once more, even if only for a few minutes. The scene became a cultural touchstone. Critics called it one of the most moving moments in blockbuster history, while fans left theaters in tears. For Kilmer, it was the final curtain call, a return that demanded no spotlight, no standing ovation, only quiet respect. It was, in many ways, the perfect ending to his cinematic journey. After that, he accepted no more roles, turning his focus back to personal projects, private recordings, and the family he loved. Top Gun, Maverick was his last message to the public, short, powerful, and unforgettable. Behind the armor of Batman, the swagger of Iceman, and the intensity of Jim Morrison, stood a man who above all saw himself as a father. Val Kilmer's personal life was remarkably private compared to his larger-than-life roles. He married actress Joanne Whalley in 1988 after meeting her on the set of Willow. Their union, though brief, brought two children into the world who would remain the center of Kilmer's universe, Mercedes, born in 1991, and Jack, born in 1995. When the marriage ended in 1996, Kilmer never let the separation dim his role as a parent. Despite living continents apart, Whalley in the UK and Kilmer in the US, he remained deeply committed to raising his children. Unlike many Hollywood stars who parade their families in front of flashing cameras, Kilmer shielded his children from the public eye. Rarely did they appear at events together, and when paparazzi captured moments, it was often by chance rather than design. He wanted Mercedes and Jack to grow up as themselves, not as the children of Batman or as Hollywood royalty. His philosophy was simple: let them find their own paths without the weight of his fame. That philosophy shaped them profoundly. Mercedes pursued acting and appeared alongside her father in the film Pay Dirt, while Jack found success in independent cinema, debuting in Palo Alto in 2013, and building a career with steady, meaningful roles. Neither relied on Kilmer's name to open doors. They carved their identities in the industry quietly, just as he had taught them. In interviews, both children recalled that their father never pressured them into the spotlight, never demanded that they carry his legacy. Instead, he emphasized one lesson above all: art isn't about fame, it's about truth. Jack once described his most vivid memory of his father not on set, but at their New Mexico ranch. They would spend hours watching old films together, analyzing camera angles, lighting, and performances. For Kilmer, cinema wasn't entertainment. It was dialogue, a way of seeing the world differently. When illness eventually silenced his voice, he taught Jack another lesson: how to speak without words. He showed me how to use my eyes instead of my voice, Jack recalled in one interview. That ability to communicate without sound became one of the most powerful imprints Val left on his son. For Mercedes, the bond was equally deep, but shaped by gentleness rather than analysis. She once admitted that the hardest part of her father's illness wasn't learning he was sick. It was when she could no longer hear his voice. Yet even then, he continued to find ways to connect. Through handwritten notes, gestures, or simply the presence of his steady gaze, he reminded his children that love didn't need words to be felt. In the end, away from the cameras and scripts, Val Kilmer's most profound role wasn't one he played on screen. It was the quiet, unwavering role of being their father. Val Kilmer's journey to stardom was anything but conventional. He burst onto the scene in the mid-1980s with his quirky debut in Top Secret, a spoof that showcased his natural comedic timing. He quickly followed with Real Genius, proving he wasn't just a passing novelty, but a talent capable of carrying roles with charm and intellect. Then came Top Gun, where his portrayal of Tom Iceman Kazansky cemented him as one of Hollywood's brightest rising stars. With a single smirk, Kilmer had arrived, and suddenly, the world couldn't look away. But fame never seemed to sit comfortably with him. While other actors rode their newfound status into easy box office roles, Kilmer sought characters that tested him. In 1991, he transformed into Jim Morrison for Oliver Stone's The Doors, a performance so raw that even those who had known Morrison were unsettled by the resemblance. 2 years later, he embodied Doc Holliday in Tombstone, delivering lines that became legendary in cinematic history. And in 1995, he stepped into the cape and cowl as Batman, a role that carried enormous pressure, controversy, and the weight of global scrutiny. Yet, even at the height of his career, Kilmer was notoriously selective. He turned down roles that didn't interest him, clashed with studios over creative control, and refused to compromise on artistic integrity. To some directors and producers, he was difficult, even unpredictable. To others, he was a perfectionist who simply refused to play by Hollywood's industrial rules. This reputation made him both respected and alienating, carving him a unique place in the industry. An actor who couldn't be bought with easy scripts or blockbuster promises. By the early 2000s, Kilmer had grown weary of the system altogether. In 2002, he purchased a sprawling 6,000-acre ranch in New Mexico, retreating from Los Angeles and the endless demands of Hollywood. This wasn't a retreat into obscurity. It was a deliberate step into creativity on his own terms. At the ranch, he painted, wrote poetry, worked on screenplays, and hosted intimate gatherings with artists and friends. He once remarked, "I didn't leave Hollywood. I just moved to a place where pretending was no longer necessary." It was the essence of who he was, a misfit, an artist, a man unwilling to bend. Even in semi-retirement, Kilmer never stopped experimenting. He directed small projects, most notably Cinema Twain, a one-man play where he embodied Mark Twain, later adapted into a film. He dabbled in independent films, appearing sporadically, not for fame or fortune, but to satisfy his artistic impulses. These projects often went unnoticed by the mainstream, but for Kilmer, they were deeply personal works that spoke to his restless spirit. He didn't chase applause, he chased truth, and that, more than anything, defined him, not just as an actor, but as a creator. When Val Kilmer's will was finally made public, the headlines focused on the numbers: an estate worth between $10 and $25 million, royalties still flowing from blockbusters, and a ranch preserved as a sanctuary. But those who knew him best understood that these figures barely scratched the surface. Kilmer's real legacy wasn't measured in dollars or property lines. It was measured in choices. Choices to turn down easy fame, to retreat when others demanded appearances, to remain fiercely loyal to the craft of storytelling even when it cost him his place in Hollywood's inner circle. Directors and actors who had worked with him shared memories that captured this complexity. Oliver Stone, who directed him in The Doors, once said Kilmer was the only actor he'd met who never cared about star rankings. Tom Cruise, more reserved, offered just one private tribute after Kilmer's death. "Without Val, there would be no Iceman, and without Iceman, there would be no me as I am today." It was a rare admission that even the brightest stars of the industry knew their light shone brighter because of him. And then there was the handwritten note found in the drawer of his desk. Simple, raw, and unaddressed. "If I have to leave, at least let me leave something behind, so those who stay can still hear me." It wasn't part of the will, not part of any grand plan, but to Mercedes and Jack, it became the most precious artifact of all. A final whisper from a father who had spent his life trying to communicate through art, now speaking directly through absence. To his fans, Val Kilmer will always be Batman, Iceman, and Jim Morrison. To critics, he will remain the unpredictable misfit who walked away from fame on his own terms. But to his family, he will forever be the quiet father who handwrote notes on the backs of photographs, who edited home videos with the same care he gave to feature films, and who left behind not just money, but meaning. That duality, legend to the world, father to a few, is perhaps the clearest portrait of who he really was. In the end, Val Kilmer's story is not one of a fallen star, but of an artist who never stopped being true to himself. He left behind films that will outlast generations, memoirs that capture his inner battles, and personal archives that turned grief into connection for his children. His was a farewell without spectacle, but one so carefully written that it continues to resonate long after his final scene. Perhaps that's why, even in death, Val Kilmer isn't gone. He's simply transformed into memory, leaving the rest of us to decide what to make of the fragments he left behind.